must start by saying that reading the novel was a very, very moving experience for me. And I was trying to think why that was the case. Perhaps because I was a literature student, and also because I grew up in the 80s Delhi. And many of the scenes, many of the characters sort of resonated with me. And Delhi wasn't then, and probably isn't still, the same kind of cosmopolitan city as Bangalore is, for instance. So the reading sort of invoked that entire context of relationships, communities, how things worked in the middle class professional world, and so on. And I was thinking that is the best possible answer to people who ask, why study literature as a program? So it's all right to say, read a lot of literary texts, but why do you want a BA or an MA degree in reading literature? I think one of the answers that sort of naturally comes from your novel is that a well-written literary piece, nothing can tell us about a milieu as much as a well-written literary piece. So I was wondering if we could start the conversation by talking about how literature creates knowledge about the world or transforms it for us.
Well, that's a huge question, Elizabeth. It just sounds very simple, but I think from the moment we are born, our primary concern is to understand where we are, and to understand that and to express it and to express our questions about it. So I think what all these mediums do, and literature in a very, very fascinating and very rich way, is to give us this possibility of searching for meaning to our existence, about what the world around us is and where are we in it. And it is that kind of very, you could say, I don't know what the word would be, a primordial question, which has been asked forever, which is our concern forever, that makes us keep exploring. So literature certainly allows us that, but there's also another dimension to literature and the arts, I think in particular, that I think we are not always writing only what we are conscious of, but we are actually trying to explore things which are hidden away in our subconscious, in our innards, so to speak, and we represent not just ourselves, but also our larger society. So it becomes a very risky and you could even say sometimes a very traumatizing business. But in pulling out our entrails, as it were, we're actually accosting society in really in its most bare truth. And that is why, literature often does it much, much better than those genres which are dealing with it only very sort of deliberately and consciously.
Thank you for that. It might be an injustice to ask you to summarize this, very, very layered and complex novel. So with your permission, may I read the summary written behind the Red Samadhi's English translation?
Please do.
The Tomb of Stone, for all our audience here. In northern India, an 80-year-old woman slips into a deep depression after the death of her husband, and then resurfaces to gain a new lease on life. Her determination to fly in the face of convention, including striking up a friendship with a transgender person, confuses her bohemian daughter, who is used to thinking of herself as the more modern of the two. To her family's consternation, Ma insists on traveling to Pakistan, simultaneously confronting the unresolved trauma of her teenage experiences of partition and reevaluating what it means to be a mother, a daughter, a woman, a feminist. During your Booker acceptance speech, you said, and I quote, Red Samadhi is a laughing elegy. that retains hope in the face of impending doom. And you've also observed elsewhere that for you, walls and borders are actually bridges. So while Ma travels to Pakistan, and in the text, there's the invocation of Sadat Hasan Mando's famous character, Toba Tek Singh. What I found different is that the novel does not have the same kind of, dark humor or satire and so on. So I was wondering, would you say that this is a new path or exploration in what we call the partition literature? In being a laughing elegy, is it contributing something else to our complex history, the aftermath of which we are, even after 3/4 of a century, we are still sort of dealing with its trauma. Do you think this book is another way of approaching that trauma?
See, first of all, I'd like to say that there is no formula or a deliberate plan with which I set out to write this book, or indeed most of my books. And I never thought that I'm going to be writing a book about partition, and nor did I think that partition is going to mean India and Pakistan. So it's actually, the book has grown organically. It's a big book, and recently I was at some other event where a painter friend of mine had come, and I'm quoting his line, maybe not quoting it, but quoting what it means. And he said that in India, we live in multiple times and multiple cultures, many things at the same time. And I think that is what is absolutely the most enriching thing about our lives. The diversity, the polyphony, the pluralism all around us and in our upbringing. I think I have grown up with that, and that is what has expanded in me and comes in my creative work and grows organically out there. But my own way is not to try and prove some point. My way is actually to just follow the most ordinary life around me. And I've said this before, but for me, the small is linked automatically to the big. The mundane is linked to the epic. So think of the most mundane action. Think of, I was washing my hair this morning, and then I was drying it. And as I was drying my hair, which is quite long, and doing those actions of unentangling it, or you jerking out the excess water from it. These are very, very small movements which go back to centuries, I think. Women have been doing it forever. So there's something absolutely eternal about it. But at the same time, every single gesture in that sense is, in some sense, is also linked to some larger view, maybe of feminism, maybe of women, long hair, tresses, poetry, etc. So you don't plan it, but the most staid little detail is linked sometimes to very momentous things. And that is what is fascinating for me in the creative process. So in this work, all that I set out with was the back of the woman, an elderly woman who is now, looks like she's tired of life. And as it turned out, I discovered that she was not tired of life. She was going to reinvent herself. And she was going to go out as much on an exploration as me. And in that exploration, she was going to come to all kinds of hurdles and difficult terrain, which she would have to leap across. And that is where the whole discovery of borders and borders becoming bridges came from. And then the whole discovery of the unnecessary partitions that we have made kept evolving in the book, and of course led me at some point to our own history and the partition of India and Pakistan. So all I would say is that it happened very spontaneously and very organically, that all these partitions came. And I would say, if it is a partition novel, then it is not just about India-Pakistan. It is about borders, it is about partitions in general, which are something which, mankind has known the world over, and not just today. The inhumanity of partitions, the divisiveness of partition, the prejudice and violence and ugliness that goes into partition, and it's against all of that. And about it being a laughing elegy, well, yes, it is an elegy for our times. This pluralism is an elegy for our times, and there's an anxiety that is not as safe and secure as we would like it to be. Laughing it and saying it, I think, is a way of life. Laughing is actually the most serious matter ever. Humor is very serious. I think it's a way of, think of Charlie Chaplin. I get nowhere near that, but think of Charlie Chaplin. He adopts the laughing method, makes everybody laugh, and says the most serious and incisive things about everything that's going on. So I think it's a way of expressing the most serious things, drawing attention to them, and hopefully sensitizing oneself and anybody who comes in contact with that reality and that way of looking at it, sensitizing them to the need to preserve it.
Thank you so much. That actually brings me to two different kinds of questions that I'd like to ask you. I'll ask it one by one. Going back to what you said about the polyphony, the diversity of our culture, world cultures. Hindi literature had this, 20th century Hindi literature had this progressive social reform movement. But you have observed that literature must not be prescriptive. Of course, it's concerned with society, and society's issues are the ones that it talks about. And yet, it cannot give answers in any prescriptive way. I wanted to use that to think about the fact that, see, now today we are faced with multiple problems, whether it is environmental concerns or gender equality or social justice, or in our case, caste issues and so on. But we have a very, very sharply divided right and left, and nobody, it seems, wants to either understand the other's concerns or open up dialogues and so on. Do you think literature, in the rich way that you are talking about it, can do something to now enhance that diversity and pluralism in its reflexive way than in its prescriptive way? Of course, there was a place for that in the post-independence, pre-independence and post-independence eras, whereas now we need to think about those complexities in the fact that, okay, we have some kind of civilizational inheritances, as well as we have some kind of global responsibilities.
Well, I think one of the first things we must realize is that the makers of literature are not gods, and that they're as vulnerable and as human.
So could you hold your mic?
I know, I always do that. So I think they're as much a part of the society and part of humanity, with the same fallibilities and same doubts and same everything. So they don't have the answers. So what they're doing is they're actually going to a place of literature in order to reflect, in order to observe what is not easily observed, in order to observe better what is seen and people have got used to, and in order to observe the invisible. So they sit a bit aside in the margins, so to speak, and try and look at themselves and look at the others and try and make sense of that. So it is a place of reflection. And it is a place where I think the attempt is to engage honestly with whatever is going on. And like I said, it is a place where you are trying to listen to the whispers, listen to the murmurs, see the layers. And that is why it's not going to be black and white and simple. And that is why it's going to indicate the complexities around. And literature has done well if it makes anyone who's dealing with it, the reader and the writer, it's done well if it makes them, it stirs them up, opens the space in them where they are thinking anew about things they were very sure about and experiencing something else and feeling something else. I think that is what literature is meant to be doing. But if we are looking for a change of the kind where, somebody walks into, does these experiments in the laboratory and comes out with a COVID vaccine, so we're not going to find any such wonderful result from literature. But making all of us much more reflexive, much more sensitive about all the things that you mentioned, of our very difficult world, and making us also enjoy life so much more, then I think literature is doing what it can and must. Yeah.
Thank you for that. In fact, one of the things that we try now in Alliance University, especially with the School of Liberal Arts, is indeed to give this kind of broad perspective on disciplines, on questions in the world to our students. So the idea is that since our experience of the world is mixed and doesn't come in disciplinary pockets, our reflection and our solution for problems should also therefore be learned from multiple places, which is the thrust of our liberal arts program. I asked you this earlier. Do you have any thoughts on the way this kind of interdisciplinary area is shaping up now, especially in Indian universities? Of course, in world cultures, the idea of the Humboldtian University was that knowledge, you have to pursue knowledge in a free and truthful manner, and that you cannot be blocked by certain forms of certain kind of tools or certain knowledges, and which is why it's even without asking what is the exact output which comes from making someone learn the arts or read literature or learn technology, you don't have to ask that question. You just know that the exposure itself will expand their minds. So any thoughts on liberal arts itself and the kind of sort of notion of good life that it is trying to pitch, that now if a globe is for everybody, where everyone must have a place, where serious questions must be debated, where fights must be fought, then what is the kind of good life for which we could prepare our students through this kind of a training?
Well, honestly, in all honesty, I think I can't give a very, very detailed and worked out answer to your question. But I have some very stray thoughts which I'll share with you.
Yeah.
One is to realize that, reality is complex.
Yeah.
And like you said, there is no single tool which is going to tell us everything about everything.
Yeah.
So we do need to look at it in different ways with different tools.
Yeah.
What we have to learn, I think, is two things. One is to respect different genres. We have to know that within each genre there is a certain certain sort of facility, capacity, ability, which the other genre will not have in that way. That is one thing to realize and to respect that and to let each genre be what it is, but going back to borders, we must realize they're not in any hermetically sealed space. So there should be porous borders between different genres so that they can look at, let's call it truth or reality, they can look at it from their different ways and put all that together and get a more comprehensive view. So I certainly think it's extremely important for more than one genre to be given its place. Again, going back to something I mentioned earlier, that you cannot see what the liberal arts do in the same way that you can see what science and technology do. So I think we have to realize the different kinds of results that the two show and realize the importance of this amorphous and sort of half visible and unclear sort of result in the liberal arts, and see the value of that. See the value of subjects which are there to bring people together, to bring the positive things of humanity into play rather than war and aggression. And this is about how society can and different peoples can live together in unity rather than separately. And I think the liberal arts are geared to that direction, and they, even when they're despairing of things that have happened, it is because they have hope of the opposite kind. So they are pointing out why the war happened and what we must do to avoid the war, because they can see the disaster of war and they don't want humans to make that same mistake again. So I think the importance of this kind of the tools which are making you think about these questions, we should realize that importance and not think that only something which has immediacy and shows an immediate result are worth it. I think today we tend to have this, something which shows its effect immediately is what we are all going for, and something which is very tangible in its result. And we think all this is a waste of time. It isn't, because this is what is actually making you, I think, better human beings. Yeah.
Staying a little bit more with your conceptions of diversity and pluralism. Earlier today we were talking about the fact that an earlier generation, including your own, in India, were very bilingual or multilingual. They could speak probably more than one language. They had a habit of reading in more than one language. You've been asked in several interviews why you write in Hindi, and you have a very beautiful answer for that. I want to ask you a slightly different question, that do you feel like today both our reading habits, our tastes, even our patterns of reflection are becoming extremely monolingual in some way, and I include myself in that. So one of the related questions is to see if our education system, including our schools and universities, can take serious cognizance of the fact that here we are living among a diversity of languages and cultures, and yet our thoughts, our patterns are becoming so monolingual. Can we do anything about this, and should we?
Well, I don't know what all one should be doing about that, but certainly it is a concern, because I think the best of us are turning monolingual. The world is turning, there's a drive towards uniformity and monolingualism in everything, whether it's thought, whether it's academic discourse, whether it's language, and all kinds of other things. And I think that is something to worry about. Now, what should be done to stop that? I really don't have the expertise to say, but I can see the problem very much. In literature, I can see that we've come to a point where, in our country, for instance, which is multilingual, but in our country, to access each other's literature, we all go to English, you know. So, I mean, a French person doesn't read, I mean, not only each other's literature, Hindi walas will often, the educated Hindi walas will read English to access the Hindi. So, you know, this is something which is really, I mean, we have to think about it very, very seriously. What are we doing? Where are we going? And it cannot be, it cannot just become, you know, like you decide as a matter of policy that we have to change it. I think we have to do things, especially in educational institutions, I think, to make these other languages a part of our daily life, a part of our living. Only then they are going to be alive and will sustain themselves. I think some of it is realized, particularly by artists. So I think a lot of us, even with our skewed education, return to our languages when we are trying, when we go for artistic expression. But still, a lot more has to be done. And I wouldn't be able to say that, look, to list the ways in which this has to be done.
A little about your writing process and your journey as a writer. I mean, I will start with the simplest question. Do you write every day? And yeah.
When I was unknown,
Yeah.
I wrote every day. And the more known I'm getting, the less I'm writing every day. Yeah. So that's a price to pay for, well, being a little bit recognized. And also, you know, it does other things. It opens up your world and you have many more interactions and you have many more activities. But it also takes you away from the cave and the solitude which you need as a writer. So certainly there is, I don't write every day at the moment. I need to keep running away to, is that telling us to shut up? No.
Maybe, no, we can ignore them because we started late.
Okay. Yeah, right. So that's
So
one.
maybe I'll add another question to that, which is, how is this process of creating a novel? I mean, is it a linear journey? Do you start from the first page and then end only at the last page? Or is it somewhat like a, you know, filmmaker shoots a film? So you would have done the probably climax first and then some other scenes and then put it all together.
Well, you know, I think every writer devises her own way of doing it.
Yeah.
And in my case, I actually do something which I find much more mysterious. I won't glorify that at all because I think, well, one is I want to quote somebody I've quoted earlier as well, A.K. Ramanujan, the poet and translator. He had written somewhere in his diary that you don't go in search of the poem. You put yourself in a place where the poem happens to you. So I think I rather go, you know, by that kind of sort of guidance and logic. I need to get away from a lot of the din and find myself in that kind of moment of solitude where I can empty myself out of the nitty-gritty enough for things which are there in the subterranean consciousness to surface. And I don't think it's as mysterious as it looks. I think we are living and thinking and reflecting and feeling all the time, and it's going into our intuition. So there is this very rich intuition inside us which has to be tapped, which has to be given its chance to, you know, come up and express itself. And that is how I let my works take their, go on their journey. What I need for that is, so they have a certain, within quotes, inspired quality, which somewhere pleases me also
Yeah.
and surprises me also. But for that, I need to get away and have a good chunk of time.
Yeah.
You know, it's a kind of experiment that I have to put myself into.
Yeah.
I have to be prepared to fail also. I have to be prepared to be sitting blank with nothing coming out. But invariably, I've found that there are things which start sort of coming out, getting together, forming a story, and a work begins to grow.
So before we throw the stage open to the audience, I have to ask you, I have several more questions, but we don't have time for it. But I have to ask you a question about translation itself. Your novels have been translated into multiple European languages, into English. So I was wondering, how does this process work when you don't speak a language and probably don't understand it at all? How is this process of engaging with Red Samadhi itself has been translated in English and French? And I believe you don't, do you speak any French at all?
No, I don't. No.
Right.
I mean,
Also,
no,
you've been translated into several other European languages.
Yeah.
So, you know, at what point, until when do you stay with the translator and say, okay, show me each line? And at what point do you say, okay, now I'll let this take its own life? And do you ever, did you ever feel the urge to translate yourself?
No, never. That question I can answer very easily. Never, absolutely, because I feel I don't have enough time to do my creative writing. So if I have the time, I would rather do that than try and translate. Also, I think translation requires a different kind of skill with languages. So it's not enough that you can converse in English and you write in Hindi. Doesn't mean that you can translate as well. I can't. But about working with the translators and my whole approach and attitude to that. Well, one, so far I've not been so massively translated as to have no contact with the translator. Okay, that's not happened yet. But so the few translations that have happened, I've been very lucky that I built a rapport with the translators. And some of it is just a risk, but I've been lucky so far. I mean, like Daisy. Daisy sent a sample to me once I agreed to the book being published by a certain, Tilted Access, my publisher in London. Once I agreed to that, they contacted Daisy, and Daisy sent me a sample, which I read, and I thought, here's somebody who's getting a sense of that, weirdly mad and crooked book, and that gave me hope, and I thought we will carry on, we'll manage it well. And then we were in almost daily correspondence, and the same with my French translator. This book has come out in French a few months earlier than the English. But, both the books were done in the COVID period. So we never actually sat down together. We were just emailing each other. And the kind of questions they ask, the kind of concerns they have, like my French translator, who I cannot, read, the kind of joy she feels in the invention of the words and the humor of the book, that is an indication of how well she could, move with that book. And let me tell you, Daisy's doing it in English, but that doesn't mean I can actually understand or judge that English. It's another English, and it's not my English, and I cannot, look at that, correct her English at all. But again, her play with the language, her enjoyment and awareness of the play and inventiveness in this book, that is what, made our rapport. And I think the main thing is to have that rapport about having a common sensibility, gaze. After that, you have to let it go. And, you also have to have a certain confidence. I don't want to sound arrogant, but my book is done. It is what it is. Good, bad, indifferent, whatever. This book, you cannot take anything away from it. Translation can bring it out in a good way or ruin it. That's a risk one has to take. I've been lucky. It's been getting new breath, French breath, English breath, whatever. And yeah, and I think it's been getting other homes, and that's very good.
It's our hope that it'll be part of world literatures and be translated into multiple languages,
Well,
not just Red Samadhi.
It should be
but
translated into
every-
Indian languages.
Yes, which
More
is
than,
probably
sort
much
of,
more important than
absolutely,
traveling
yeah.
to the world.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Geetanjali ji.
Thank
We'll
you.
now take
Thank
a
you.
few questions from the audience. So maybe 3 or 4 questions, and the volunteers can pass on the mic.
See, the worst thing that's happened to me post the Booker is that people suppose I have answers. And actually I don't, and especially not one-line answers, which are often and instant answers. Otherwise I wouldn't be, struggling for 8 years to write a book. So this is something, I mean, be prepared. I don't have answers, but it'll be nice to be in conversation.
So I was wondering whether, I thought that only happened to PhDs, that it got stretched for 7, 8, 9 years. It was the first time it sort of even entered my head that even novels could.
I'm sure, well, I think a novel decides when it's time for it to say bye-bye. Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. Actually, my question to you is about the process of writing the book. Writing a book isn't as easy, even though we see so many writers here right now. And as a young female Indian student who is a writing enthusiast, could you please elaborate more as to how the process of writing the book was and the kind of hurdles that you faced and what inspired you to keep going? Because definitely a book written around the time of partition is not easy, even for us in today's age, to imagine what it would be like to be in a time and era like that would be close to impossible. So what inspired you to keep going and complete the entire story about a time that, a lot of us can only imagine?
I lost some of your words, but I think I've got the general thrust of what you're saying. Well, I mentioned a little about the process, that I don't set out with a formula, and I don't have a, worked out story to tell, nor do I have a conclusion in mind when I'm starting. But what inspires me? See, I think, again, I said it right at the beginning, we are searching for something right from the start. We're all searching for something, and we are searching for, we just want to make sense of the world we live in. We want to make sense of our life. We want to make sense of the madness around. We want to, if possible, change the ugliness and bring back beauty. And we want to notice the beauty to enjoy it. So it actually becomes just part of living. And my way of living and my way of expressing has become literary expression. So every single time, there is some inner need. Inspiration is everywhere, because everything is a story. Life is a story. All around us there are stories, in my home, outside, in the newspaper. There's stories all the time. They all inspire you. And you want to, if it's when you want to unravel that you need to sit down with paper and pen and you start, just slowly unfurling whatever you've begun and seeing what roads it goes on and where it takes you, and whether you reach your destination or whether you just have this enjoyable journey which opened up lots of things for you and prepared you for another journey to be taken later.
हेलो गीतांजलि मैम, आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। बैनपुरी से लेकर बेंगलोर तक की जो आपकी यात्रा है, हम सब आपका स्वागत करते हैं। रेत समाधि जो आपने समर्पित किया है वो कृष्णा सोबती जी को किया है। कृष्णा सोबती जी ने जब मित्रों मिर्जानी लिखा तो समाज में एक नई लहर और साहित्य में नई हलचल उठी मित्रों के चरित्र को लेकर के। उनके शिष्य आप हैं और जो रेत समाधि में चंद प्रभा और अनवर को लेकर के आपने पूरी कहानी गढ़ी है, मैं समझती हूँ कि कृष्णा सोबती का ही आप उन्हें आदर्श मानती हैं और एक नई चुनौती हमारे समाज को मिली है।
मैं उनको अपना आदर्श ज़रूर मानती हूँ। वो मेरी बिल्कुल वो मेरी गुरु थी। वो बातें अपनी जगह बिल्कुल सही हैं, लेकिन इसका ये मतलब नहीं है कि मैं उनकी तरह लिखने की कोई कोशिश कर रही हूँ या उनके पसंदीदा विषयों को चुनने की कोशिश कर रही हूँ। हर शिष्य को भी अपनी ही यात्रा पे निकलना पड़ता है। गुरु से वो दबंगई सीखते हैं। अब कृष्णा जी की बात हो रही है तो मैं कह रही हूँ कि गुरु वो उस तरह की शख्सियत थी कि जो उन्हें कहना था वो बिल्कुल बेलौस कहती थी, निडर होकर कहती थी, दो टूक कहती थी और उन्हें कोई किसी का डर नहीं था। मतलब पूरा जो एस्टैब्लिशमेंट है, हिंदी वर्ल्ड है, कोई किसी का भी हो, तो वो जो चीज़ है वो मुझको बहुत उनकी प्रेरणा देती थी और मेरी भी हिम्मत को उसने बढ़ाया। तो उस तरह से ज़रूर हमेशा उनका मैं मानती हूँ कि आशीर्वाद, और मैं उनके छाया में ही पली बढ़ी हूँ, लेकिन रास्ता मैंने अपने आप चुना फिर।
So we can take one last question. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So my question to you is, as a Hindi writer, there's a lot of talk of Hindi imposition from the central government, and there's a lot of resistance to it in the South. So as a Hindi writer, what are your thoughts about Hindi imposition on non-native Hindi speakers?
Hindi is last bit? Hindi? हाँ. Do you have any doubts about my answer? Don't you know that I absolutely don't agree with the official policy of forcing any language down? I mean, no language can be forced down anybody. You can only make the language, you can only, destroy the cause of the language by attempting to force it down people's throat. That is no way. A love for a language has to be inculcated, which happens with completely different things in different ways.
So we can't end this session without hearing some portion of the novel, yes, in your own words, a small piece in Hindi, definitely in Hindi, and if possible also in the English translation, if, yeah, we have time for that.
Stand there?
Yes, absolutely, please.
It's not a very long piece, so try not to, don't worry. And it's a short piece about the family, North Indian family, and I think has some humor, and it's about the daily bickerings that go on in families, which can remain small and meaningless or can conflagrate into big things, causing tombs of silence. So this is what I'm reading, first in the Hindi, then in the English. कहना चाहिए परिवार को, जबकि कहते हैं महाभारत को, कि जो दुनिया में वो उसमें और जो उसमें नहीं वो कहीं नहीं, कवि के तसव्वुर में भी नहीं, यानी भूला भटका आतंकवादी, गर्मा भरमा वामपंथी, नारीवाद और नारी, हरवादी और जीती हारी, सब परिवार में या महाभारत में, जिसे जैसे रुचे पचे। महाभारत में दुनिया, दुनिया परिवार में, और इसलिए परिवार में महाभारत, जो रोज़ रोज़ के हंगाम, हर एक महाभारत। इसलिए परिवार के हर सदस्य को पता है कि जो मुझ में वो किसी में नहीं, और जो मुझ में नहीं वो होने लायक नहीं। और ये कि मेरे पास दिमाग है औरों के पास पैसा, और ये कि मेरा फ़ायदा उठाया सबने अब हम नहीं बाकी करें, और ये कि हम दूर रह के भी रहम दिल तुम वहीं हो पर कितने बेरुखे, और ये कि हमेशा हम ही देते हैं और आप हमेशा लेते हैं, और वाह आपकी सूझ जिसमें आप तो मिलनसार, हम वही तो मतलबी यार, आप चुप तो विनयशील, हम चुप तो काइयाँ, आप करें सो शिष्टाचार, वही हम करें तो लल्लो चप्पो, आप कहें तो साफ गोई, हम कहें वही तो बदतमीज़, हम पूछ लें तो अश्लील जिज्ञासा, आप पूछें तो हमदर्दी, हम करें तो हमारी सुविधा, आप करें तो आपकी कृपा, हम करें तो कंजूस, आप करें तो किफ़ायती, हम चुप तो घमंडी, आप चुप तो शर्मीले, हम तो बड़े सीक्रेटिव पर आप तो बस रिजर्व्ड, और हमारे फैशनेबल कपड़े नकल, आपके ज़माने से कदम ताल, और हमारा गया तो ऐसा क्या बवाल, आपका गया तो लुट गए हाय हाय, और हमने किया तो क्या किया, और आपका इरादा वो भी किया, यानी हम वो जो हमने किया, आप वो जो आपने सोचा, और हमने कहा तो कटाक्ष, आपने कहा तो मजाक, और हमने अपनी बताई तो मियाँ मिट्ठू, आपने बताई तो सहज सत्य, और हमने पा लिया तो हथियाया, आपने पाया तो आपका अधिकार, और हमने कहा तो हमारा गुमान, आपने कहा तो आप तो हैं ही सही, और हम गुस्साए तो ह्यूमर की कमी, आप गुस्साए तो आत्मसम्मान, और हम कर गए तो कर्तव्य था, आपने किया तो बड़प्पन हुआ, और हम सफल तो आपका सहारा जो मिला, और आप असफल तो हमने अड़ंगे जो डाले, और जी हम रह गए तो हम काहिल, आप रह गए तो आप त्यागी, और जी हम न समझे तो पैदल, आप नहीं तो भोले, और जी आपको हमसे वैर तो हम इसी लायक, हमको आपसे वही तो हम ईर्ष्यालु, और जी हमने किया तो स्वार्थ, आपने वही तो परमार्थ, और गर हम न करें तो बेपरवाह, मगर आप न करें तो मजबूरी, और हमने जितना किया सो कम, आपने ज़रा भी सो ज़्यादा, और हमारी नाक टेढ़ी तो बदसूरत, आपकी आँख टेढ़ी तो कलात्मक, और जी अपनी तस्वीर अच्छी तो फोटोग्राफर माहिर, आपकी अच्छी तो आप तो सुंदर, और जी हम गोरे तो छिली बटेर, आप सफ़ेद तो आप तो विलायती लगें, हम काले तो बैंगन भट्ट, जबकि आप काले तो ब्लैक इज़ ब्यूटीफुल, हम मोटे, आर यू शटिंग मी अप? 2 more minutes. हम मोटे तो खाऊ पेटू, आप मोटे तो रौनक चमक, हम दुबले तो सूखी लकड़ी, आप सीख तो सौम्य सजिल, और हम चलाएं एसी तो अय्याश, आप चलाएं तो सेहत नाजुक, हम पिए तो शराबी, आपने पी तो डॉक्टर की हिदायत, हमारी ज़बान अंग्रेज़ी तो शो ऑफ हम, आपकी तो शिक्षित आप, और जी आपका काम काम और हमारा काम तमाम, यस जी नो जी हम जी तुम जी और हम और तुम और तुम और हम और अम्मा और इतना हमने किया और तुम साथ हो के न देखते, और बेचारी बुढ़ा गई और पड़ी रही और अकेली और जानती भी नहीं क्या कह रही है और नाम भी गलत सलत दे रही है और दिमाग पर है असर और सब के सब दौड़ पड़े। शुक्रिया। Okay. Now the same in English. Maybe you'll understand this better. Because of the government policy, nobody understands Hindi. Anything we say about the Mahabharata could also be said about families. They contain all that exists in the world, and whatever they don't contain doesn't exist. Not even in the imagination of a poet. That is, the gone astray terrorist, the hot-headed leftist, the female and the feminist, the everythingist and the opti-pessimist, all in the family, or in the Mahabharata, whichever you prefer. The world is in the Mahabharata, the world is in the family, and thus the Mahabharata is in the family. The daily flare-ups, each one a Mahabharata. For this reason, every member of the family knows that what exists in me exists in no one else, and what does not exist in me has no call to exist, and that I have the brain, others have the money, and that everyone has taken advantage of me, so from now on, I won't do anything, let the rest of them do it. And that I'm the most tender-hearted despite living far away, while you are right here, yet so completely inconsiderate. And I'm always the giver, and you are always the taker. And wow, your wheeling dealings are just because you are such a friendly soul. But if I do the same, I'm cold and calculating. When you are quiet, you are polite. But when I'm quiet, I'm wily. If you did it, it's good etiquette. If I do, it's fawning flattery. If you say it, it's candid. If I do, it's just rude. If I ask, it's obscene curiosity. When you do, it's sympathy. If I do it, it's for my own convenience. If you do it, you're most beneficent. If I do it, I'm being stingy. If you do it, you're being thrifty. If I'm quiet, I'm acting proud. If you are quiet, you feel bashful. I'm extremely secretive, but you are just reserved. And my fashions are four, whereas yours are cutting edge. And if I lose something, what's the big deal? But if you do, you've been robbed, woe is me. And if I do something, it amounts to nothing. But your merest intention of doing something amounts to actually doing it. That is, I'm what I've done, you are what you've thought. And what I said was scornful, but when you said it, it was just a joke. When I said my piece, I was being a show-off, but when you had your say, it was the unvarnished truth. And if I got it, I grabbed it. But if you got it, it was your right. And if I said it, I was deluded. But if you said it, you were just right. And when I get angry, I'm humorless. But when you do, it's self-respect. And when I went and did it, it was my duty. But when you did, it was big of you. And when I'm successful, I got help from you. But when you are unsuccessful, it was me who threw a spanner in the works. And if I get stuck, I'm a slacker. But if you get stuck, you blew your chances. And oh yes, if I don't get it, I'm a moron. But if you don't, you're innocent. And oh yes, if you're enemies with me, I deserve it. But if I'm with you, I'm jealous. And oh yes, if I did it, I'm self-serving. If you did, you're self-effacing. And if I don't do it, it's carelessness. But if you don't, it's helplessness. And however much I've done is not enough. And whatever little you did is plenty. And if my nose is crooked, it's ugly. And if your eye is crooked, it's artistic. And oh yes, if I look good in a picture, the photographer was gifted. But if you look good, it's because you're beautiful. And oh yes, if I'm fair, I look like a skinned quail. And if you are pale, you look like a foreigner. If I'm dark, I'm Mr. Eggplant Head, whereas when you do, black is beautiful. If I'm fat, I'm Tubby Tupkins. If you are fat, you're pleasingly plump. If I'm thin, I'm dry as a stick. If you're skinny, you're svelte and shapely. And if I turn on the AC, I'm decadent. But if you do, you suffer from delicate health. When I drink, I'm a drunk. When you drink, doctor's orders. If speak in English, I'm giving myself airs. If you do, you're educated. Oh, and if you need it, we're all one big family. But when I need it, you're separate and alone. And yes, your work is the bee's knees, but mine's a hobby, if you please. Yes and no, no and yes, me and you and me and you and I and Amma, and we did so much and you were with her. But you didn't see, and the poor thing grew older and she lay there and alone and didn't even know what she was doing, and she's even forgotten and inventing some imaginary names, and her memory is clearly affected, and everyone went running. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Geetanjali Shree, for this short but impactful interaction and the reading. Now, as an expression of our gratitude and affection, we would like to present Dr. Geetanjali with a memento. I request our Pro-Chancellor, Mr. Abhay Chebi, and our Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Anubha Singh, to come to the dais and felicitate the speaker with our festival memento.